Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today is Rafael Oganesyan, the founder of the Armenian Election Study (ARM-ES) and an instructor at the University of Las Vegas. Rafael is working on the first scholarly-driven analysis of the Armenian voter. Since 2017, ARM-ES sampled 1,062 households about their economic perceptions, political preferences, and so on. Rafael, thank you for joining us again. So, Rafael, you were an observer during the parliamentary elections that took place on December 9. What did you see? What struck you during the electoral process?
Well, thanks for having me. And first, I would like to congratulate the Armenian voter and the Armenian people on a truly multi-party, free and fair election. I think various third-party organizations today have come out and said that this is the most free and fair elections in our history. So with that, I'd like to congratulate all of the people who participated and also those who didn't. So I served as an observer, as it was called, the independent observer with the Helsinki Vanadzor organization. Now I was stationed, I was a mobile observer, so then I basically went from precinct to precinct. My precinct was Nornork. However, I also attended Gervesh and also Saritagh. So a couple of, a brief synopsis of what I saw. By large, no voter fraud, right? That being said, some minor irregularities. So the most common irregularity was the fact that you had campaign posters within 50 meters of a precinct. Now, Central Election Commission law states that there cannot be any campaigning or campaign posters within the 50-meter mark. That said, it's clear that those posters were not there, were not placed there right before the election. They were there for quite some time. And also what you have is you have these precincts that are right next to schools, right next to buildings, or sometimes precincts within schools. So thus it's very clear that these posters are gonna be in buildings, right? To parallel off that, Armenian law says that these bulletins, or these posters, they need to be placed on bulletins. They cannot just be placed randomly without the consent of the owner. So another violation we saw was, posters being placed right on a building, on a common property. That's technically a violation, not necessarily a big one. So this was something that was widespread. I mean, it was everywhere we went. We kindly asked the police officer at that precinct. We kindly informed the head of that precinct and said that they're in violation, and they gladly took that down. There was no issues there. Another potential issue we saw was that you had individuals voting. So in Armenia, it's not like in the West. In Armenia, it's still a paper ballot, and you are given a small little box, right, like sort of a nice rectangular box in which you go and you vote in secret. Now, some people decided they did not want to wait in line and try to vote in line. Other people wanted to, basically they were not comfortable with the box, so they wanted to move outside the box and vote in plain view. Now, that's also not tolerated. Another issue was you had usually elderly people who wanted assistance, and either their spouse or their child would actually go with them into the poll, and the child being overage, and try to help them. Now, in the Central Election Committee requires that any helper needs to be properly registered. So, we had to say, hey, you can't do this, we need to properly register you. Now, in the event that a voter wanted assistance, what would happen is the head of the precinct would announce, is there anybody that's willing to give assistance to this voter to vote? Now, the proxies, the head of the precinct, the independent observers, we cannot assist in this. A couple of issues, in a couple of events, there was nobody that volunteered. So this person is right behind the voting booth, standing and waiting. They have all their papers out, standing and waiting for some assistance. Finally, what not necessarily a violation, but a complication. And the complication was this whole 11 ballots back and forth. Imagine you give that to an 80-year-old male or female, and they just want to vote for a party. They're confused. And I think the longest time it took to vote, which I timed, was about 41 minutes. Somebody took 41 minutes to vote. And they went through, basically got confused, tried to figure out which paper is which. So I believe it created an unnecessary burden on part of the Armenian voter. But overall, my general analysis is that these elections went smoothly, they went great. The precinct that I was at, where we closed down at 8 o'clock in Nornork, the voting went very efficient. We actually got done right a little bit after midnight, which is technically unheard of in a parliamentary election. We were expecting to get out at 4 a.m. But it was very smooth. I mean, it was these should be the baseline elections by which future elections occur.
So can we say that this is the first step of a real our democracy in Armenia?
I would actually argue right now, I'll be willing to rest my hat on this following statement, that Armenia has a higher electoral democracy than Hungary. Today, Armenia is more democratic electorally than Hungary. And why would I say that? Hungary's last election, where Fidesz was challenged by Jobbik, and essentially they had a hard time getting reelected. Large parties, large third-party organizations ruled that election free but not fair. What they essentially said is that Viktor Orban, who's the head of Hungary, used state resources to help himself win elections. So various third-party organizations criticized that election, and Hungary is part of the EU. And it's important for us to sort of draw a comparison with Hungary, an EU member. And today, what happened was the OSCE today, in their official report, verbal report, said that Armenia had free and fair elections. In fact, one OSCE member said that Armenia's elections, he said, are no similar than elections in my home. And he was a German member, and he said in Germany, we had the same type of elections. And the only difference he made was that the proxies in Germany are not partisan. And that is such a small difference that, I mean, I think everybody should be proud here that we have not only demonstrated that we are capable of having free and fair elections, but we can also compare ourselves with several EU countries and say that we have managed this in a better manner.
Let's talk about your own study that you're conducting about the Armenian election. What were your predictions before the electoral process, and did those predictions match with the outcome of the elections?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. So when we closed the precinct in Northern Newark, so the votes start coming in, right? We're counting the votes, and we realized right off the bat, obviously we're independent observers, but it's clear, given the political climate of Armenia, everybody sort of knew who was going to win and who was going to come in second. Right off the bat, we start seeing the Republican Party of Armenia have a lot of votes in the beginning, and everybody's thinking, oh, are they going to come in second? As the votes are coming in, I'm telling my fellow observers, I'm like, well, these votes are still early. What's going to happen is my step's going to come in first, Bargavach or Prosperous Armenia is going to come in second, Lույս and Bright Armenia is going to come in third. And everybody's like, well, how do you know this? I'm like, well, I'm the head of the Armenian Election Study. We did a cross-national sample of 1,133 households, which we finished Saturday. Yeah. And our results said that the Republican Party would not make it in the top three, that the top three would be my step, followed by a Prosperous Armenia Party, followed by Bright Armenia Party. And fortunately, our results held. I know in the beginning, if some of our fellow citizens were up at night, they saw various parties, including the Handrapetakans, the Republican Party, and the IRF, the Dashnaks, over the 5% threshold. And everyone's like, oh, what are we seeing here? That being said, the precincts that we're reporting were smaller precincts, and essentially the Central Election Commission today upheld what we found. Now, I would like to basically read to you our vote results that we found. Remember, this is a pre-election study. So the question that we asked was, if elections were held tomorrow, who would you vote for? Now, based on our study, preliminary study, we had 63% that voted for, that said they would vote for my step, 2% said that they would vote for Prosperous Armenia, and then 1.2% the vote for Lույս. Now, 31% of those surveyed say they did not know or refused to answer who they vote for, right? So we had a large chunk of voters going into the election. We had a large chunk of what's called undecided voters. It's clear that these undecided voters divided themselves among these three parties, right? So it's not really a surprise. Today when I woke up in the morning, I was not surprised. I was quite happy that we were accurately, this is the first time that we accurately predicted an election. Last time we had Prosperous Armenia Party winning. And we all know that the Republican Party of Armenia won. But the main conclusion that I reach here is that we were able to successfully forecast and predict how the election was going to come, going up to the day of the election.
Prosperous Armenia is a really special party. It is led by Gagik Tsarukyan, which is a businessman. He's in the political fields for a long time. He even has been quite close to Serge Sargsyan with the Republican Party, and he's quite conservative. How come this party is at the second place in this election? I mean, because he's not really far from the Republican Party's ideas, everything.
So what we have to understand is the Armenian voter is a simple example of the post-Soviet voter. Now, in the US, voter behavior is largely led by partisanship, right? So in America, if you're a Republican, you're going to vote Republican. And the reason you're Republican is because you have what's called issue convergence with the Republican Party. So if you're socially conservative, if you're fiscally conservative, your party points or your preferences are going to align with another party, and the closest party that comes to your preference point, you're going to vote for that party. So if you're a social conservative, fiscal conservative, you're going to vote for the Republican Party. And that's the way in developed or advanced democracies, that's the way elections work, and that's the way partisanship works. When we bring it over to Armenia, it is completely different. Armenian voters, despite the fact that they're partisan voters, they do not base their partisanship on issues. They base it on economic and political prosperity for them. So they're essentially, what I have coined is patronal voting. And I take this from a colleague or a mentor, Dr. Henley Hale, who coined the word patronal politics. And what patronal voting is when individuals vote based on their pursuit, based on their economic pursuit. So they vote out of affection, out of a personal exchange. So if I give you an example, the average Armenian patronal voter would vote for a party because they are somehow connected to this party. Now, why is this the case? Well, in Armenia, we have lacked the rule of law. So if you want to start a business, if you want to essentially become an entrepreneur, or if you want to engage in economic mobility, in this country, for the last several or a couple of decades, you would need to know somebody, and that person needs to be a party head. So thus, when you enter the voting booth, you ask yourself, well, who am I going to vote? And you vote the way you do because you realize that if that party is no longer in power or doesn't have any power, your livelihood is at stake. So one interesting thing in 2017 that we found in the Armenian Election Study, the number one predictor of the Armenian vote was not partisanship. It was whether the person worked for government or not. Individuals who worked for local and federal government were way higher in terms of probability to cast the vote for the Republican Party. The number one predictor of the Republican Party's vote was not partisanship. It was whether the person worked for government or not. Now, why would that be the case? Well, maybe that person who was hired was not hired because of merit, and they know that if the Republican Party is no longer in power, their job is at stake. Now, anecdotal evidence being anecdotal evidence, I mean, in various small circles in my trip this time around, I heard that people are getting fired. Civil service individuals are getting fired because they just happen to have a job under a Republican administration. So this idea of patronal voting and using patronal dimensions to engage in political behavior makes sense in Armenia. Now, to go back to your question, why Bargavach, right? Well, Bargavach has a personal or patronal dimension that is present in Armenia.
Bargavach is prosperous Armenia.
Bargavach is prosperous Armenia. So individuals vote for Gagik Tsarukyan, they vote for prosperous Armenia because they have some connections to this party. And in this party, either in small pockets of Armenia, so in Kotaik region, they manage political and economic affairs. So this is not really surprising that prosperous Armenia comes in second. Obviously, Armenia is still a patronal society largely, and we expect voters to either vote based on the personality of the party, which Mr. Tsarukyan, one can argue whether he has natural charisma, but he's a very charismatic leader. People are drawn to him. Whether they're drawn to him because of poverty, because that he's going to help them pay their bills, doesn't necessarily matter, right? People are still naturally drawn to him. Then there's another set of voters that have an indirect relationship with him and the party, through their uncle, through their friend. And they realize that if they do not vote for him, if the Prosperous Armenia Party doesn't make it to parliament, their economic mobility, their trajectory in the socioeconomic status is limited.
Last question, what would be the next step if we go back to your study? What would be the next step in your study regarding people's perception on Armenian politics?
I think so. It's the fact that we've already established that we can do free and fair elections. The next thing we want to do is, the next step will be to measure whether we start seeing the emergence of issue-based voting. Now, up until yesterday, Armenia did not necessarily have legitimate free and fair elections, discounting the first election. Armenia's political atmosphere was defined largely by personality types. In fact, if we go and we look at various OSCE reports about Armenians' elections, there's one thing that's common. Armenian parties do not have policy points. These are parties of personalities. Thus, voters are mostly personality voters or patronal voters. Now, assuming that there's a successful democratic breakthrough and My Step can come in and establish itself as a legitimate and accountable government, the next interesting thing to measure would be the emergence of issues with the Armenian voter. One would hope that in the next election, 5 years down the line, parties would run on issues. Now, this election, free and fair, all aside, this election, this campaign was still largely about personalities and about valiance issues. By valiance issues, we're talking about general things that everybody agrees upon. Everybody said, I'm going to get rid of corruption. That's not necessarily taking a position, right? Corruption is a valiance issue. There's not really differences in policies. One would hope that moving forward, parties can distinguish themselves between policies. And voters would then engage in policy-based voting. Now, why is that important? Because that would naturally increase the political sophistication of voters. Voters would spend time to read about the policies of these parties, to read about their policy points, and then align these policies with their preferences. So I would no longer vote for, let's say, I would no longer vote for Prosperous Armenia Party because my uncle knows Mr. Sarukan. I would vote for that party because their policy regarding taxation, regarding pension, regarding the Karabakh conflict, regarding even issues that there's general agreement on, corruption, differs. So, I mean, going forward, I would hope that in the future we have elections that are based on issues instead of elections that are based on personalities.
Thank you, Rafael, for this talk. Thank you for watching and continue to follow CivilNet.